Alright, just going to quickly show how to go through various stages of gain staging with an EMU sampler, and you can use plugins like VST plugins and that sort of thing. What I've got here is actually like a bass, and I'll show you what I've done up here in the computer. Basically what I've done, you can see right there, that's the sub right there. I'll see if I can play that really quick without blowing ears up. Give me a sec. So you can probably barely hear that. So yeah, that's basically gone through a bunch of my gear, and then I've just basically rolled a lot of the highs out of it, so it's still got that sort of mid-range rumble. But with these two here, generally what I normally do when it comes to bass, like I'll get a nice clean sub, and more often than not it'll just stay in the computer. I won't actually do any hardware processing, because as most people will agree, you get a much cleaner sound when you keep your sub bass lines in the computer. Now, I don't always like that sound. Like, a lot of my influences that I draw from you know, like 90s bass music, where everything used like hardware samplers and outboard gear, so all the sub, you know, was kind of like rolled off at like 45-50 hertz or so. Like, it didn't really have that deep kind of sub that's familiar with a lot of bass music these days. Like, you know, for instance, like your more minimal sort of techno and stuff like that, it's, you know, predominantly made within a computer environment. Yeah, so in this instance I have put the sub through the equipment, and I liked the kind of old school sound that it gave it. And then what I've done is I've taken a couple of stabs. I think I've deleted them now, unfortunately, but I did have some variations of this. I basically just kind of like chopped the 3 different parts, and then what I did was I put Camel Audio's Camel Fat, which is a very popular plugin amongst drum and bass users and dubstep as well, like for those that, you know, still make dubstep, I guess. But yeah, so I mean, I always find that using Camel Crusher or Camel Fat, you get a really nice layer of distortion. So if it's already gone through the gear and then you put one of those plugins on top, you can really kind of accent and bring out the high and mid range, and it just sounds a little bit cleaner. So you do that, and like, I'll give you an example actually. So if I put Camel Fat on this one now, on this sub layer, and normally what I do is I'll go into like one of these presets and I'll just randomly pick one. So like that automatically has got a bit of a nice ring to it. And then I'll basically I'll either flick through the various different sounds here, like the different presets, sorry, or I'll just click randomize until I find a nice sound. You know what I mean? Like, so something like that, for example. And if you just kind of like fine tweak it, you know, I don't need any compression on it. Magic EQ normally works pretty well, but we don't need it in this instance. Sometimes you'll have the link on, so that only allows you to kind of move them both at the same time. A lot of the presets kind of load up with that on, but if you have it like this, you can kind of fine tune it a little bit more. So it's still a little bit hardcore at the moment. If we bring it right down, okay, we're kind of getting there. So if we have a look, maybe a little bit too much mech, maybe just a fraction bit of mech, and the filter's switched off, so we'll turn that on. So we're getting there. So now if we start playing around with a dry and wet, and maybe accent the highs a little bit more. No. So it's hard to say if it's going to work or not, you know. All right, so that's kind of what I'm sort of going for right now. So you can hear that it's really ripping on top of a sub bass. So I'll typically do that, and I'll never ever leave it just like that. Like, I haven't done that for about 5 years. There was a time when I just used Ableton and Camel Crusher and I got some really good results. However, these days I've got to put it into either my MPC, which is 16-bit, and there's quite a few nice options that I've got here for distortion. Main one being this bit grunger up here, and you can play around with a dry and wet on that as well. Like if you go into your program section here and say it's on that pad right there, it's typically always set to 100. So, and this applies to outboard equipment as well, you know, like just play around with your various different volumes. So come over here now. So say my sound was on that pad, for example. I've got various different stages of volume or gain changing, like whatever you want to call it. And then of course you can do all that in here, and then you've obviously got the output volume as well. And in my case, I'm running into this old Yamaha desk here. I don't turn the gain up on this, I just keep it nice and clean. That then runs into my Mackie Onyx desk. Typically I'll record that back into Ableton, and then 9 times out of 10 it'll wind up in the EMU. So okay, so forget about this one that I've made up here, that's not important anymore, I'll just turn that one off. But what I will do is I'll quickly show you what I came up with after a little bit of processing in the EMU. So you can see there I've done a bit of crossfading on the last two, just so it's not so like stabby, like dun dun dun. And yeah, so that's taken a little bit of time in the EMU, as it does. Not ages, you know, like maybe 15-20 minutes. And yeah, so now I've got those individual layers, and then what I've done is I've put them into a group, and I've applied a few things. I've just got like a stereo compressor as well as a limiter, just making sure the levels don't clip, and I've got the release nice and quick. And then I've got a glue compressor on, and that's really good just for kind of like molding these two parts of a sample together. And now I could have put those together and done crossfading, but I didn't get a very nice result, so in this case I've split them up. So I've done that, and then I've come down here and I've recorded those individual sounds as one sound into the EMU. And you can do that as well in your DAW. If you were to, you know, start another audio group, another audio track, yep. And then what you would do is you would as I've got these in a group, I'm sending those to the master. As you can see right here, they go into the master. And then on this new channel that I've created here, instead of the external in, we want to record it from the master. See there? And then you just turn that off and you'd hit and then you'd record it. So you basically get those two sounds would just kind of record as one in this section here. Now you can do that in any DAW, it's not just Ableton. But in this instance I'm going to show you how I do it in EMU, because I know a lot of you guys appreciate the videos that I do showing how to do a few tricks with the EMU, and I'm more than happy to show you guys, as I love this machine. Yep, so I've come down here and I've recorded it in, and I believe I recorded it at 44. Yeah, I did, I recorded it at 44. And then immediately after recording it, I've come down here into sample rate convert. I've selected the creamy filter, and then I've taken it down to 22, so it's about half what it normally is, sample rate. And that's just kind of nice, just for kind of rolling off the really sort of harsh high end, or like the tops that you get from a computer program. So I like to do that, and it just makes it overall just like a little bit warmer, a little bit kind of thicker. So yeah, that's kind of like a standard technique that I do. I either do it when I'm recording straight in, I'll basically just record it at 22.5. But you always get different results. Like that's the weird thing about the EMU, like it's never just one way works for the whole machine, you know. There's just so many different, you know, things you can play around with. It's never going to sound the same. Like, yeah, take my word for it. I've been using these for a while, and you would think like, oh, it's sample rate convert, like doesn't matter what menu you do it in, it's going to have the same result, but it gives it a different sound. I really don't quite understand it. Yeah, anyway, so in this instance I have done that, and then if we exit that, I've got my sample there, and then yeah, I made a copy and I took it down to 18. So I've downsampled it a couple of times, and that might sound a little bit over the top, but that's how you get a really nice warm sound. That's how you get it from sounding like, you know, sort of like stabs, like these snares that I've got up here, for example. Like, rather than having it like do do do, you can kind of just like glue it all into one sound. So that's what happens when you fuck around with a sample rate. So I've done that, and then I've also come into the exciter, and this thing is just crazy. Like, I used to use it at like 35 to 40%, and I just found that it can quite often ruin the sample. So if you take the amount right down to like 15%, try it. If it doesn't sound too good, try it again. Unfortunately, the only way you can actually reverse what you've done is if you've got a hard drive inside the EMU. If you've just got the floppy drive and no internal hard drive, it won't let you do the undo. So a quick workaround that is if you just click Sample Manage, Utilities, and copy it. And just make a few copies of a sample, and then say you come in here, say you apply 20, and it's just too much. It's just way too much. Okay, so you don't have the undo function, but you can just be like, whatever, I'll try this one, you know? So if you make like 3 or 4 copies of the same sample, your emu's got enough internal memory or storage, whatever, to handle, you know, 4 or 5 samples. It's capable of much more than that. So don't sort of assume that I don't have an internal hard drive, so I don't have the ability to stack up, you know, loads and loads of samples. Like, these things take up next to nothing, and it also really depends whether they are being processed as WAV files or if they're in the EMU E4B format. So if they're in that format, they're super low size, and yeah, that can really help. But anyway, so that is a quick workaround. So just make a copy, you know, maybe like 3 or 4 copies. Try it, you know, try 5. If that's okay but you barely notice it, maybe go back out, click on your next copy and apply 7 or 10 and just see how you go. And when you finally work out which one it is, if you need to start from scratch again, then you can. But this Exciter really just adds some nice like sizzle on top of like the mid-range bass. So yeah, that's kind of like an old trick of mine. I've been doing that since like 2011, and it always works a treat. Works really nice on your sort of like atmospheric-y sort of pads and things like that. So yeah, and this is what I wound up with, and I'll show you what the result of that is. Now, I should mention that I normally have just my individual EMU channel coming up here, but one of my send channels, that goes to my Green EQ. So that's pretty much how I do all my bass and drums. So this will obviously sound a little bit exaggerated, but like I said, you can go back into the computer after having been in something like an EMU or an Akai sampler or whatever, and you can then apply something else, like maybe a Camel Crusher or Isotope Alloy, you know, one of the various distortion plugins that you can get. I should mention that Camel Crusher is really good because it's actually freeware, so Camel Fat I'm pretty sure you have to pay for, but Camel Crusher is actually freeware, so that's a great way to start getting that really nice mid-range bass distortion. So yeah, maybe look into that. Of course, if you can afford to get some good, really good sort of distortion plugins, then that's good as well, but I think you'd be better off getting like a really shitty analog desk, like a really cheap one secondhand, and just run your audio out of your computer into that and just turn the gain right up all the way, and you'll get some nice distortion. You might have to sort of play around with the volume a little bit and sort of find a sweet spot, but yeah, I think that will work much better than a plug-in, in my honest opinion, but each to their own. So anyway, this is the result of what I've come up with, and I'll just have to play around with the volume a little bit here. No, sorry, I'll show you the EMU first and you'll get an idea of that. So you can hear it sounds like nice and kind of glued together. It doesn't sound like 3 individual sounds as such. Like the first and the second note have a bit of a gap, but that's because I've got them kind of triggered from the kick and the snare, so it's not going to be anywhere near as noticeable when it's in the actual recording, like in the arrangement. But you know, if you go back and listen to the original way that it was, it did sound very kind of stabby. It didn't sound like one sample. for obvious reasons, because you have chopped it up in the computer. So, but yeah, so that is the Emu Dry right there. I don't even think I've got the gains at 12 o'clock. Tops, mids and lows are all even. And then if we check out my green EQ here, you'll hear what happens when you clip one of the EQs on here. And in this case it looks like it's just the input gain, because everything else is set to 0 as well. That's my output. Keep that nice and low because it's quite a noisy unit. Yeah, so let's have a listen to this and see how it sounds. Now, do you hear how that's kind of like, there's like a slight rip towards the end of the first note? Now I can really bring that out a little bit more if I just play around with like fine tuning the volume. And you hear there, that's like perfect. Perfect. So that's all it takes sometimes, you know, like just, especially with the Emu, like a little trick for you guys if you don't already know. This is kind of like the sweet spot on the Emu sampler volumes. I'm not too sure about like pre E4 samplers. Like I've got an ESI 32 and I haven't had quite the same result with the sweet spot, but on the E4 samplers, you know, like your E64 Classics, Ultras, you know, E5000s, E4 XTs, all those ones, they've all kind of got this like sweet spot right around here. It's more actually about there actually, and so when you just go a little bit over, like you can hear if it's too much or not enough. And it's kind of like a well-known thing amongst like Emu users, you know, like people that use these samplers all the time. They will all tell you about the sweet spot on the volume control. So yeah, and you can hear that. Like now, I probably could get that result with the Emu, you know, like if I resampled again and again and again. Sorry. Yeah, if I resampled like maybe 2 or 3 times and clipped it on the way in. Let's turn that down a little bit. So you see that it's not quite hitting the end. But if I turn that up a little bit more, see how that's like completely going into overdrive? Now that's a little bit short. Now a lot of people will tell you, oh, don't ever go all the way because you'll wind up like distorting the sample. But that's exactly what you want to do in a genre like drum and bass, or you know, I guess techno, something like that. Yes, like something where distortion is kind of like a common practice amongst that genre. So that's how I would do it if I just had the Emu and a computer. And yeah, in this case I've got the green EQ, so I can just kind of like, you know, mess around with the input gain. You know, I can like boost the lows a little bit and kind of just make it clip a little bit. But yeah, so that's how you get that really nice kind of harmonic distortion from using outboard gear. And I'm sorry to say, but you won't get that result that I was just showing you in the computer environment. It just won't happen because, you know, for those that don't know, you start going above 0. Yeah, like right here. You start going above 0 there, that becomes digital clipping. And same applies when you're using like a lot of your plugins. So your audio will wind up looking like this. I'm sure everyone watching this already knows this, and I don't mean to sort of assume that you guys are stupid. I just want to sort of cover all areas of this, you know, because people do ask all sorts of questions. So, you know, if you start overdriving your software samples, you wind up with this. You know what I mean? All of your dynamics are lost. They're meant to stay within this rectangular shape, but when you start driving it in a computer, that becomes digital clipping. It's like taking a pair of scissors and trimming off all that, all those dynamics in that sample. So, but when you do it in the analog gear, like, even though this is a digital sampler, it's still going through an analog desk with analog cables and such, you know. Because it's happening in that environment, you can go overboard. You can do what I was saying about, like, pushing it all the way. You know what I mean? You're not cutting off the top of the sample, you're pushing it into a stage of harmonic distortion. So it's analog distortion, and it's creating extra harmonics on top of the original sample. So that is the benefit with hardware. That is something that you will only get with hardware. And, you know, there's very cheap ways of doing it, you know, like if you got like a little sort of stomp box or something like that, that can work really well. I have that hooked up to my MPC as one of my assignable outs, and I keep it pretty low, you know what I mean? Like, there's a drive there. I don't really like push that too much, I just keep it nice and low. And yeah, you get some really nice results. You know, it can sound a little bit kind of muddy at times, but that can work really well if it's maybe like a sample that you're not too fussed about it being like high resolution or something like that, you know what I mean? So yeah, alright, that's basically what I wanted to cover. I'm planning to do a bunch more videos explaining how to do some other sampling bits and pieces in EMU. I'm also going to be doing some videos talking about some different bits of equipment that I have, a few new additions to the studio, and yeah, so I plan to do some videos just sort of talking about like other pieces of equipment, maybe how to incorporate that into your, you know, your workflow. Doesn't matter what synth it is, you know, you just the basics of like taking that and then like twisting it up into EMU, or twisting it up in the computer and then putting it into the EMU, you know, like there's so many different stages of sampling, you know, and it doesn't have to happen any particular way. Like drum and bass in particular, as a lot of people used to say back in the day, like the reason that it got to the level that it's at is through the misuse of technology, you know, like the gain was never meant to be pushed past 12 o'clock, but when you did, you got some really nice results and people started realizing it. And yeah, so I'll just finish by saying maybe take on board the advice that I'm dishing out, but don't necessarily assume that like that's the only way that you can go about it. Like, just try everything and see what results you get, and yeah, make sure you let me know, because I'm always up for advice and tips and tricks and all that stuff. So alright, until next time, big up.